How's it going, everybody? The Mythical Pickle here, and welcome to Fallout New Vegas. Today, we will be answering the question historians have been contemplating for millennia. Can you beat Fallout New Vegas as a Lobotomite? Now, without further ado, let's lay down some ground rules for the challenge run this time around. To start off, we have some standard rules that are likely to be seen in future challenge runs. That is, no companions of any kind, aside from quest mandatory ones, of course. I must stay in character with all dialogue choices and fraction decisions, so that means I'll have to stick to the shortest sentences or the borderline psychotic ones. And last, but certainly not least, I must beat the main quest. Now for our more unique rules. As the title suggests, I will be playing the role of a Lobotomite fresh out of the think tank. This means I can only use weapons found on Lobotomites. And as the list suggests, I'll only be capable of wielding these weapons when I reach the required spawn levels. I also have a few leveling restrictions this time around. Even though this Lobotomite could body the Hulk, he is still dumber than a sack of potatoes, so that means for the entire run, I cannot level Charisma or Intelligence, and on the same token, I must leave a few stats at their base level as well. That being the two intelligence traits, Medicine and Science, which that alone is gonna make this playthrough much more difficult, and also the two Charisma traits, Barter and Speech. As I don't know about you, but I don't think being brainless is going to make me any better at persuading people. Or would it? And to further the challenge, there is also an armor restriction this time around, that being the Lobotomite jumpsuit, as well as the Lobotomite headgear, meaning I can only use the clothes I start the game with. And surprisingly enough, unlike my last challenge runs, we won't be running any mods this time around, as this game hasn't aged the greatest, especially with the engine, and I found that it was truly functioning the best when running as vanilla as possible. Now, I might fix this in the future, but for now that means we're doing it full vanilla. Now with all that out of the way, let's dive right in, shall we? First things first, we've got to think of a name that really conveys a Lobotomite in its truest form. Or, right, he can't form proper sentences. Alright, well, it is then. Now that we've got our boy, looking nice and spiffy, it's time to do a stat breakdown for our intellectually endangered powerhouse. We've got to get my special stats properly spread so I can get the most out of my sparsely available weapons as soon as possible. So, that's a 10 on strength, of course, to get that extra damage boost, as melee damage is primarily scaled through strength. 10 on endurance for a bit of extra health, as my clothing offers little to no armor rating. 5 on agility, as I figured it would prove pretty useful to have more available AP for VATs. And lastly, an 8 on luck, as I'll be counting on those sweet criticals to proc during our more intense encounters. As for the skills I'll be focusing on, the first is melee, as just as you've seen earlier, the majority of our early available weapons are melee weapons, especially the more powerful ones, so we definitely want to boost that as early as possible. Now, I focused on guns here as well, as some situations are just better solved with a ranged weapon, and some of the earlier weapons are all ranged. But, as you'll see later, this proved to be quite unnecessary. And finally, like any experienced Fallout New Vegas player knows, we've got to get that repair skill nice and high so as to mitigate the cost of repairing your items constantly. And finally, the traits I'll be starting with this time around are Wild Wasteland for a bit of added enjoyment and challenge, as it's basically a wasted trait. Also, the heavy-handed trait, as I'll be relying heavily on melee combat throughout this challenge run. Now, just before leaving Doc Mitchell's house, I made sure to rob him blind, and that included our very first weapon, the kitchen knife. Now, with brains removed and a rusty kitchen knife at the ready, it was high time for to journey into the Mojave Desert. First on our quest of world domination, I spoke to the Sunny Smiles, where I was then taught the coveted art of hyper-lethal beverage vessel assassination. And I received the second of many weapons we can add to our arsenal, the varmint rifle. After the sodas were carefully dispatched, I made my way inside the saloon, where I caught the tail end of a death threat coming from none other than the corn on the cob himself. So, to save some time and bullets, I tried to assassinate him using my knife. But for some reason, the local residents took that as a challenge, so I proceeded to do it the old-fashioned way. After I accidentally managed to implicate myself in a gang-related squabble, I went to Ringo and we gathered the rest of the town that was willing to help, aka just Sunny Smiles. Now, given that I hadn't leveled up yet, I had no idea how this was gonna go. But it should have been no surprise that absolutely annihilated any and all powder gangers in his path. With the town of Goodsprings now on good terms, it was time to head to Prim, where I spoke to Johnson Nash about their missing deputy problem. So, like any good Lobotomite would do, ventured forth into the Lucky Casino, where he showed the resident convicts exactly what it means to be a deranged lunatic. Now that the deputy was now secure, I headed forth to the Mojave outpost, as I had some very important business to attend to, while of course making a brief detour to handle some jackal thugs. Now, finally at the outpost, I did a few gopher quests to get the much needed experience points, including a less than pleasant trip to Nipton, where I found a great powder ganger massacre had just concluded. After receiving straight up death threats from Vulpes, I wasn't about to let that slide. So naturally, I grabbed the sharpest object I could find and went to slicing. Though the legionaries didn't take that too well. After more attempts than I'd like to admit, was no match for these legionaries at this point, so I bitterly turned my attention to Novac, where I led an evil elderly lady to her demise, and harassed the local villagers into giving up some very valuable info on Benny, the guy who shot me in the head. But they didn't give it up easily. Manny Vargas claimed he had some info I needed on him, but he needed some help clearing out the ghoul problem at their local junk heap. But once I arrived, I found that the ghoul presence wasn't exactly as described. There was actually a cult of ghouls that were less than feral and actually quite cordial. And even though was borderline feral himself, missing a brain and all, he wasn't a monster, so wiping them out the old-fashioned way was not an option. So I opted to help them fulfill their dreams of space travel after having dealt with a few nightkins that stalked their halls. Now, with the ghoul problem finally concluded, Manny was very open about his knowledge of Benny and his whereabouts. He actually gave me a lead to Boulder City, where I met up with a few NCR troops in the midst of a war between the local jackal gang. So took it upon himself to clear out every last one of them with his now very well equipped arsenal. After U's blinding fury subsided, the remaining NCR troops gave me another lead on the whereabouts of the checkered suit man himself. Now it was high time I stormed the gates of Vegas to exact a much overdue bout of revenge. Though, just before I could, I happened upon a family of bighorners which I might have left alone, but when one charged me, I had no choice. It all had to go down. After the massacre of Vegas Lake, I eventually found my way to the City of Sin. Selling a few items to the gun runners, I stepped inside and met some old friends, the Kings. Though they didn't exactly offer a warm introduction, more like a shakedown. And even though all these guys clearly have an equally unhealthy obsession with Elvis, there was still one that ruled over them all. And he mentioned that he'd pay out if I did some work for him. So I obliged, and he gave me 200 caps ahead of time to pay for this little business venture. But because I already knew U's intelligence and charisma weren't even close to high enough to take on that little quest, I took the money and ran. Which was a good move on my part, as I was able to pass the credit check at the gates of the strip without a hitch. The second I stepped inside, though, I was bombarded by a Securitron demanding my presence at the Lucky 38. I had considered siding with Yes Man in this run, but being that is a lobotomite, I feel like he really lacks any of the critical thinking skills that would be required to single-handedly defractionize the control of the dam and, by extension, New Vegas. So, I turned my sights to the legend himself, Mr. House, as I'm sure a mindless lobotomite is exactly the kind of no-questions-asked worker drone he's been looking for. Enter the era of Mr. House. After discussing the current issue of e-commerce and its effects on the current state of the general economy, Mr. House made it clear we had a related interest in Benny. That is, he needed to be dealt with, some way or somehow. So I made my way to Benny's last known location, the Tops Casino. And lo and behold, there he was, checkered suit and all. After Benny tried to talk his way out of the little confrontation, I knew there was only one way to solve this little Benny issue. I was gonna have to take him out the only way he knew how, with a little knife dance. But unfortunately, Benny's goons and the entire staff of the Tops had other plans. Sadly, as a lobotomite, U's defensive capabilities were severely lacking, so that meant I had to play along with Benny's little charade. After Benny's incredibly unforeseen backstabbing, I absolutely decimated his now much more vulnerable goons with my knife of despair. And then I made my way back outside, only to find that the little asshat had run away. Again. I went searching for him in his presidential suite, but he was nowhere to be found, though I did find his trusty companion, Yes Man. Sadly, I had to bid our new friend farewell, and I left the casino in search of Benny. But my search didn't last long, as I was greeted once again by the designated legionary creeper, Vulpus, who said that Caesar's Legion had abducted Benny and had him held at their base of operations, of which I was offered a very strongly encouraged invitation. And, against my better judgment, I took him up on it and headed to Cottonwood, where I was transported by boat to Caesar's Fort. Begrudgingly, I left most of my weapons at the gate and made my way to the man, the myth, the legend, Caesar. Even though he had absolutely no reason to trust me, he asked that I made my way to their bunker and use the platinum chip they took from Benny to destroy any and all tech found down there. In return, I would get to choose how Benny bit the big one. With a reward like that, wasted no time making his way into the bunker. Luckily, the guards gave me all of my gear back for this, so I absolutely demolished each and every robot that dared look at me funny. And to my surprise, Mr. House popped up on a conveniently located monitor where he asked that I disregarded Caesar's orders and uploaded the platinum chip to the network instead. And since I did plan on siding with the big robo-boss man, I did just that. When I returned to Caesar, he was none the wiser that I completely ignored his orders and still offered me the choice of what to do with Benny. Now, as much as I wanted to duke it out with him man to man in the arena, the only weapons permitted there were machetes, and since this challenge run didn't permit the use of those, I was forced to use the old stabby stab technique I had been practicing. And to my surprise, I found that a well-placed hit on Benny when he's kneeling down would send him flying, and actually allowed him to stand. But, of course, that was short-lived. Now with Ben eliminated, I returned to Mr. House to tell him the good news, though he had even bigger news to share. Now, the Securitrons were ultra-equipped with military-grade weapons and self-healing properties. Now that the platinum chip was finally secured, it was time to start tying up loose ends. House asked that I look into the Omerta family that ran the Gomorrah to see what they had been up to behind the scenes. Now, if you've ever played New Vegas, you'd know that the Omertas are perpetrators of some very serious crimes against humanity. Without getting to any more detail, I of course wasn't about to do business with them. Instead of politely talking to them about the happenings of the Gomorrah, I pulled out my rusty kitchen knife and got to slicing down these human scum. The fact that I get good karma for every one of these guys I mowed down speaks volumes on their character. Even so, I returned to Mr. House, who was less than impressed by my recent transgressions against his cohorts. So much so, I didn't even get the chance to meet the cannibals. It was really too bad. I was really hoping to topple their crime regime as well. Oh well. Now that I no longer had to deal with the frivolous proceedings of the strip, it was finally time to take out one of the more major thorns in our metaphorical sides, the Brotherhood of Steel. On the surface, this seemed a simple task as they had just one base of operations in the Mojave, the bunker. But the minute I arrived there, I was swarmed by their entire regiment. Even though they didn't shoot me on sight, I had the bright idea that I'd destroy them all with my beautiful new sledgehammer. That didn't go quite as expected, though. So instead, I ran past them and took out all of their chairmen. So much for high security, I guess. Now that I looted all the department heads for their access codes, I was able to initiate the self-destruct sequence on the bunker. And on my way out, I found it. The one melee weapon to rule them all. The Super Sledge. But my delight quickly turned to despair upon consulting the Lobotomite weapon pool. Are you And with that rollercoaster of emotions out of the way, the Brotherhood of Steel was no more. Good timing, too, as Mr. House made me aware that the president was flying up to Hoover Dam to give a speech, and it was us' job to make sure the president wasn't assassinated. So I journeyed up to the Great Wall and spoke to the head NCR ranger that was overseeing the security detail of the dam. Now, even though I was quite aware of the few assassins that lurked about, U's intelligence and perception wasn't quite developed enough to understand that a missing janitor and a puddle of blood in the janitorial closet isn't actually a recipe for a smooth operation. I even tried to take out the sniper atop the towers, but because I couldn't prove he was a suspect, and he was dressed as an NCR ranger, I couldn't do anything about it without the entirety of the NCR turning on me. So I did what any other mindless lobotomite would do, and just sat there waiting for the speech to conclude, daydreaming of donuts and bacon. But just before the bacon finished cooking, the president got fried. Needless to say, that cut the speech a bit short. Now, having to report back to Mr. House about this, I was quite surprised to find he blamed me for this, when he clearly made the blunder of sending to protect the president, a guy whom bolsters a whopping 2 IQ. But regardless, Mr. House continued with his plans of control over the Mojave. But before I could get too carried away with that, I had a few things to attend to first. Of course, I need to level up a bit, and I did so by gallivanting around the New Vegas hills in search of some long-clawed friends. Yeah, that didn't quite go as I had hoped. I'm just gonna... There was only one more thing the Lobotomite must do before the great battle of the Hoover Dam. Coincidentally, it is also the biggest step of the challenge run. Yep, you guessed it. It's time for some sci-fi mischief and general sarcastic merriment. Now, the main reason I chose to play the Old World Blues DLC before beating the game is the physical perks I gain, such as the ones shown on screen. And, to top it off, could finally meet his long-lost brethren. It should also come as no surprise that everything the Lobotomites drop, I can use, which is a very nice change of pace compared to our previous tragedies. Now that I was lobotomized a second time, I felt it was only right to restore the sync to its former glory, which meant finding each and every personality matrix in the dome. Now that that's all been taken care of, let's take a moment to appreciate the voice acting put into these sync characters.
What do you want, mugs, huh? You some kind of sick mug hoarder? Oh god, give me the coffee cup, please! It's sitting there in your pack, taunting me!
Of course, citizen. That's my duty and sole joy in life. All those books from before the war, full of seditious, treasonous, complicated thoughts. Just dump them in and lickety-split. I'll have them pulped.
Ooh, yeah, dig that sweet music. Damn, it's good to be back online.
With the sync fully restored, I skillfully navigated Big Mountain to attain the necessary equipment to siege Mobius's high-security fortress. When I made it inside said fortress, was faced with the greatest boss battle he had ever endured. But, with no regard for his own safety, leaped into the arena and slayed the beast with careful, calculated swipes of his photonic blade. And just like that, nothing stood between me and Dr. Mobius, who had stolen my brain from the very beginning. I was ready to smack Mobius into next week, but as it turns out, he's quite a pleasant fellow, regardless of the incessant Mentek consumption. Now, with that anticlimactic conclusion to this adventure, I was free to speak with my brain, which was waiting in the same room. After arguing with my disembodied brain like an old married couple, we agreed that it could remain outside of my head, but first we had to return back to the think tank to demand that I be set free. They begrudgingly agreed to my terms, and the Old World Blues DLC was now complete. Now that was armed and dangerous, it was time for the final battle of Hoover Dam. The first part of the battle was nothing to write home about, just wasted a few legionaries that thought they could outpower the powerhouse that had become. Oh, and did I mention we made friends with the boomers? After receiving fiery rain support from the heavens, I made my way down to the dam's control room, where I found it guarded by 2 fully armored NCR troops. I started to second guess my chances of taking these ones out, but I was stunned to find that I dropped them both with 1 solid swing to the jawline. Now inside, I gave Mr. House control over the network, flipped the breakers, and made my way to the Legate's camp, where pulverized every last legionary they threw our way. With the camp handled, that just left the Legate himself. Being a man of few words, wasted no time jumping into battle. Brain or no brain, even the greatest warrior of the Caesar's Legion stood no chance against the sheer willpower of this Lobotomite. With the Legion now put in its place, it was time to do the same to the NCR. And although I tried reasoning with Oliver to have him take his ball and go home, he refused and instead insisted on battling despite the sizable army of militarized robots that watched behind him. So, I danced around his bullets as the Robo-Buddies took care of business. After speaking to Mr. House, just like that, Vegas was under new management, proving once and for all that yes, you can indeed beat Fallout New Vegas as a Lobotomite. As always, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Also, if you guys have any ideas on what challenge runs I should do next, drop a comment down below. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and as always, remember to smile.